Hi, everybody. This is part 2 of lecture number 9. Part 2. Part 2 of the housing lecture. And we're going to talk about the Gothic revival. So we're going from the Greek revival to the Gothic revival. And this is covered in chapter 3 of Bricks and Brownstone, which is on Dropbox. And it's also covered in the Row House manual. There's some good diagrams in that. The Gothic revival is like the Greek revival, a revival style. And like the Greek revival, it's also part of the Romantic movement. And it also is roughly the same time period, although its heyday was a little bit later, more like 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. But it started much earlier than that, in the late 18th century, and it didn't go away. Like all of these revival styles, it just kind of had kind of a peak of popularity, but it was like anything in fashion, there were kind of waves that came and went. The period that we're talking about is mid-19th century, but if you look at buildings late 19th century, 20th century, you still see a lot of Gothic revival buildings. The Woolworth building, for instance, from 1913 is a Gothic revival building. But let's look at a few precedents for this style of architecture. So if the Greek revival is looking at antiquity, classical antiquity, it's looking at ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and those buildings, the Gothic revival is looking at medieval architecture, and specifically the great cathedrals of the 14th, 15th century. And there's lots of examples. I'm just going to show you a few of them. This is the Milan Cathedral, which began in the 1300s. And you can see how elaborate Gothic architecture is. And it has these kind of like rocket shaped finials, they're called, and a lot of detail on the facade. And they have these pointed arches, Tudor arches as windows. This is, of course, probably one of the most famous Gothic buildings in the world, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, that began construction in the 1100s. And this famously burned last spring, just about exactly a year ago, I think. Sorry, 2 years ago. That was the big story last spring, was the fire at Notre Dame. 2 years ago. Seems like a long time ago. The roof burned off, a lot of interior damage. Anyway, but you can see the three portals there going inside. They have those pointed arches. That's typical of the Gothic style. And there was a real emphasis, on verticality in Gothic architecture. This is Chartres Cathedral from the 13th century. And you can see this on the side aisles there. You can see again those pointed arches. On the outside there would be buttresses holding the walls up, and those great stained glass windows, and the vaults in the roof. These are all elements that were then borrowed for the Gothic revival of the 19th century. So now we're skipping ahead 500-600 years from the medieval period to the 19th century. And this was one of the buildings, one of a handful of buildings that really popularized the Gothic revival as a style. This is, of course, the Houses of Parliament with its famous clock tower, Big Ben, jutting up there. And the architect here was Charles Barry, but his assistant was Augustus Pugin. And Pugin was the person mostly responsible for popularizing the Gothic revival as both an architecture style and as a philosophy. So Parliament began construction in 1840. And Pugin was not just an architect, he was also an artisan and a draftsman and a writer. So in 1841, Pugin published a book that was called The True Principles of Pointed or Christian Architecture. This was an obsessive how-to manual that had drawings and details of Gothic brackets and coins and arches, and something that a hypothetical church that he designed called the Ideal Church. And this book had a tremendous impact on architects everywhere. And this had a huge influence on American architects. It wasn't until Pugin and The True Principles was published that American architects could really learn how to design in the style, because Gothic architecture is very complicated. You have to really master the craft of all this intricate detail, these interlocking forms and all this ornament that is all over the facades. Just a very complex architecture to figure out. So without Pugin's books, it's unlikely that American architects would be able to figure this out. The first really convincing Gothic revival building in America was built in New York, and that is the Third Trinity Church at the corner of Broadway and Wall Street. So Trinity, this is the third Trinity now, so same site. This is looking north up Broadway. It's on Broadway at Wall Street. So the first Trinity Church was 1696. That church burned in the Great Fire of 1776. It was rebuilt in 1790. The church, the Second Trinity Church, which I think I showed you in a slide earlier in the semester, lasts until 1839. And in 1839, after a series of really difficult, very harsh winters, there were cracks that developed in the ceilings. And the church hired an unknown architect from England named Richard Upjohn to evaluate whether the church could be repaired. And he determined that the church could not be repaired and it needed to be torn down. So 1839, he begins demolishing the Second Trinity Church. In its place, beginning in 1841, he builds a Third Trinity Church in the style of Pugin's architecture. And this is directly influenced by Pugin's True Principles book, and specifically by Pugin's Ideal Church. It's almost a copy of Pugin's Ideal Church. And the material here is brownstone. This church is still there at the corner of Broadway and Wall Street, and well worth a visit. And this was the first really convincing example of the Gothic revival in America. Simultaneously, there's another church going up on Broadway about a mile north of Trinity at 10th Street. This is Grace Church. And Grace Church was designed by James Renwick Jr., who was born and raised in New York City. His father was a professor at Columbia. Renwick Jr. was himself a graduate of Columbia. And he was also relatively unknown at this point, but became, like Upjohn, became one of the most famous architects in America. And for both of them, Trinity Church was Upjohn's first really significant commission of a public building in the United States. Likewise, this was Renwick's first commission. And what can you say? I mean, both of them, young architects, nailed it. I mean, both of these churches, Trinity and Grace Church, are absolute masterpieces of the Gothic revival. And both of them heavily influenced by Augustus Pugin and his writings and his designs. Grace Church is not built in brownstone, it's in marble, and but very similar in plan and in style. Renwick then goes on to an illustrious career as one of the greatest American architects of the 19th century. And you all know this building, which was much later, St. Patrick's Cathedral at 5th Avenue and 50th Street. This was probably Renwick's most famous building, although he did a lot of other stuff, including the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Prolific architect. St. Patrick's started construction in 1858, but then it was interrupted by the Civil War. So it wasn't actually finished till 1879, but it really belongs to that period of the Gothic revival that we're talking about today, which was like 1840s, 1850s. But it took forever to build it. It's much, much bigger than either Trinity or Grace, and much, much more detailed. You can see those twin spires towering above 5th Avenue. Absolutely magnificent building. If anyone here has not been inside, you really need to go in there and walk around a little bit. It's really incredible. But let's talk about row housing. So how did you get this, a row house, from this, a cathedral? So we talked about taking Greek temples of antiquity and building row houses that were alluding to those precedents, and how the Greek revival row housing kind of reduced this temple-like architecture to details around the doorway. The Gothic revival was even more difficult to cram all of these details into the row house typology. And for this reason, the Gothic revival didn't fully catch on in row housing. And Charles Lockwood explains this in Bricks and Brownstone. There certainly were a lot of them built, but not nearly as many as in the Greek revival style or the later Italianate style. What had to happen is that the details from these cathedrals really had to get abstracted in order to fit the row house template. It worked a little bit better if there was a standalone Gothic revival house where the architect wasn't so constrained by that 25 by 100 foot building lot. But in terms of row housing, it was really quite the challenge to make a row house look like a cathedral. So let's see what they look like. So one thing that happens in Gothic revival row houses is that things do get more ornate than in the Federal or the Greek revival periods. You start to see some of these details from cathedrals, the pointed arches, things like that, grafted onto the row house form. So first of all, one thing is that the moldings in the cornice get more ornate. And you can't really see them in the photograph on the right. This is of 2 row houses in Brooklyn Heights. And again, these were 2 of the houses we were going to see on our walking tour. And there's a detail from another building, but basically the same detail on the lower left there. And this has 2 motifs One is the egg and dart motif, which you can see on the top there, which alternates egg shapes with dart shapes. And then below it is something called bead and reel, which alternates these oval, little oval figures, the bead and the reel. So you see that happening in cornices of these buildings. In terms of materials, they were often made out of brownstone, but not always. You also see them, Gothic Revival houses, in brick or even in wood. But these ones are in brownstone. And then the window details start to get a little bit more complicated. The lintels you can see wrap around the top and sides, a little bit on the side, and then kind of flare out. And those are called hoods. And they're basically like abstracted Gothic arches that have been flattened around the square windows. And then around the main entry, you see these elaborate hooded doorways, often with the pointed Tudor arch. And you have Tudor arches above the door, and then something, the part on the top is often called a hood mold, or just a hood. So these are, these houses, I can't remember the date, but like 1840s, 1850s, and basically intact. You can also see, it's kind of hard to see in the photograph. This is why I love doing the walking tours, is the Gothic, these Gothic Revival motifs repeat in the railings as well. And then these are a whole row of them nearby that are a little bit less detailed, have a different type of cornice there. They have these kind of brackets in the cornice, but you can see, again, the pointed, kind of squished pointed Tudor arch around the main doorway and the simplified hood molds around the windows. And again, this row of houses are brownstone as well. So the Gothic Revival didn't fully catch on as a mode of housing, but I have to say they're some of my favorite row houses because they're so unusual. And the ones that were built typically pretty well and are pretty convincing. So now we're going to move on to the Italianate. So the Italianate is also a revival style. It came right on the heels of the Greek Revival and the Gothic Revival. And again, there's a lot of blurring together of the chronology. The Italianate was catching on while the Greek Revival was still very much in fashion and the Gothic Revival was coming into play. The Italianate had become fashionable by the mid-1840s, and it lasted throughout the rest of the 19th century into the 20th century. So the Greek Revival, its precedents, were the classical period, Greek antiquity, Roman Empire. Gothic Revival, they were looking back to the medieval period, and as far as the Italianate goes, this is looking back to the Renaissance. This is a revival of 15th century architecture, especially the architecture of Italy, of Venice and Rome and Florence. And this is covered in chapter 4 of Bricks and Brownstone, and also in the Row House Manual. So let's look at a precedent for this. There are many precedents for the Italianate style, but perhaps none better than the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice. And this was built in the 1500s. The designer was Sansovino. What a remarkable building. I mean, so this is marble. It's 2 stories. It's got statues everywhere. It's got arches within arches, and just so much detail and ornament. really fussy type of architecture, the 15th century Venetian Renaissance architecture. I mean, no surface, there was no blank surfaces. Let's just throw as much ornamentation as we can. But you'll notice, compared to the Gothic architecture, the medieval period, which was accentuating verticality, what's going on here, right? This is emphasizing the horizontal, the separation between the first level and the second level is accentuated with these horizontal lines. And that was one of the characteristics of the Italian style. That and layered openings, like arches within arches, within columns, within columns. So the first really convincing building in the United States, it was built in the Italianate style, it was right here in New York. It's still there today, at the corner of Broadway and Reed Street. Eventually, it expanded all the way to Chambers Street. And this is the A.T. Stewart and Company dry goods store. And this was completed in 1846. It was America's first true department store. This was one of the first really big scale commercial emporiums that sold dry goods, meaning generally imported textiles, wool and linens and cotton textiles that people could turn into clothes, both for men and women, and also sold other things like pots and pans and mirrors and chandeliers and things like that, but mostly dry goods. And it was the first store that really catered to customer and helped turn shopping into a social ritual. It was the first store in America that had fixed pricing, for one thing. Before that, everything that you bought in a store, you had to negotiate, and you would haggle with a clerk, you know, I'll give you a quarter for it, he wants 50 cents, blah, blah, blah. So Stewart's was the first one that just had set fixed prices, and the first store that really catered to the customer. So there was like a lounge for women to come in and relax. It became a real destination, especially for women who at this point were very restricted in the way that they moved around the city. For instance, it was considered social suicide for a woman to be seen in the financial district when the stock market was open, things like that. So for women, shopping became an activity that they could do on their own or with their friends, and it gave them a chance to get outside. And so Stewart's was a godsend for them because it was so welcoming, and they could go there and kind of have a space of their own. Men went there too, of course, but it was primarily catered to women. The architects of Stewart's is the firm Trench and Snook, which is, for my money, the greatest architecture firm name ever. I wish I could work for Trench and Snook. So this is Stewart's, and you may be underwhelmed when you see it, but it's, for its time, at 5 stories. For its time, it was, believe it or not, tall. It was right next to City Hall Park, and it was made out of marble, which was still a pretty expensive, rare material. You'll recall that City Hall was also made out of marble. And this was a really futuristic building. This was the first really convincing Italianate building in America. And so this was critically acclaimed when it opened. And it's still there today. Here it is today, now surrounded by skyscrapers. And you probably wouldn't look at it twice unless you know the history and you know what to look for. It's got a later addition on it, which I've crossed out there so you can see what the original building looked like. But again, you can see this emphasis on the horizontal lines, especially there's a heavy line of stone between the second and third floor that kind of emphasizes those horizontal layers like we saw in the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice. And then it's very symmetrical, and the windows, you'll notice, have full surrounds, full frames now, not just top and bottom, but all four sides. That's one of the characteristics of the Italianate style. Here's another precedent. This is from a little later, 1857. This is the E.V. Howitt and Company store. This was also not a department store, but this was a fancy goods store, meaning they sold china and silverware, things like that. It was probably the most famous store in the country, mid-19th century, for that kind of stuff. And the architect was John P. Gaynor, and the builder, really interesting person named Daniel D. Badger. And here it is. It's still there today. This is a landmark, one of my favorite buildings. And again, you can see the emphasis on the horizontal layers. The layers really being accentuated between the floors. Here's a detail of the facade. You can see these little Corinthian columns, and then the windows are these are set within this row of columns, each with a little kind of fake balcony, and then little columns supporting an arched window. So it's got this layered facade that's really just obviously inspired by Biblioteca Marciana and other buildings like it of the Renaissance. Something has happened to this slide where the label there has been obscured. It's hard to read, but it says cast iron. So this is 1857. This was the heyday of cast iron as a building material. And Daniel D. Badger, the builder, was one of the pioneers, the main pioneer in America, really in the world, for building with cast iron. And he had a factory in Manhattan. And what they would do is he would fabricate all of these pieces individually. So all the columns, all the brackets, arches, using molds. And they would pour the cast iron into these bowls, and they would harden. So they had this kind of inventory of mass-produced columns and capitals and things like that. And then they could mix and match and bolt together all these components once they arrived to the site. So they would deliver all of these different components to the site and then bolt them together. And so it really sped up the time of construction to be able to do this. And so suddenly you saw cast iron buildings all over the city. In fact, all over the country, and Badger delivered parts all over the world. So he did, I think, a train station in Rio de Janeiro, and he did some warehouses in Cairo, Egypt. So he was shipping these components all over the world. And in New York, he did hundreds upon hundreds of buildings. I don't know, something like 800 buildings or something in New York. Hundreds of buildings just on Broadway alone, where this building is. So cast iron really caught on. One of the main things is that they were hoping it was promoted as a fireproof material. And you'll recall from previous lectures how fire was such a big problem in the city, going back to 1776 and then 1835 fire, 1845 fire. They're always worried about fires. So people thought cast iron is great because you can build more quickly with it, and it's also fireproof. Well, it turns out that's not true. As they found out in the Great Fire of 1871 in Chicago, the Great Chicago Fire clearly demonstrated that cast iron is not fireproof. It burns more slowly, but what happens when it's subjected to extreme heat is that it basically falls apart. The bolts melt and all these components just fall down like they're dominoes. So it's not true that it's fireproof, but relatively speaking, it's more fire resistant than, say, wood would be. but probably no more fire resistant than brick. Probably less fire resistant than brick. But the buildings that were built in cast iron, like the Howard store, are just way cool. Here's another one. This is the Carey building, also built by Badger. This is just to the west of City Hall Park. Same year as Howitt's, 1857. Architects here are King and Kellum. And here you can see it. These are all cast iron. You can even see, if you look closely, there's some rust coming out of those brackets in the cornice and around the windows. So usually these are painted, and you have to keep painting them, otherwise they rust. But what a beautiful building. Look at that little entablature. It says Carey building on it. All of these would have been separate components put together on the site. And these buildings, a lot of them are still there. If you go to Soho, there's a whole Soho cast iron district that you can look at, and there's buildings by Badger and other people. So a lot of these buildings have lasted. They're, you know, really pretty durable, and they still look great. So you should go see them. So in terms of row housing, when we go from public buildings like the stores I just showed you to row housing, a similar thing happens where the palette of materials and forms has to be kind of reduced to fit this template of the 25 by 100 foot building model. The Italianate style caught on in a big way. After the success of Stewart's store, this became all the rage, and everybody wanted an Italianate row house, and this coincided with the population of the city going through the roof. So there were entire blocks, as you can see in this photograph, were built in the Italianate mode. And a lot of these buildings have survived and are still here. In fact, they were typically built out of brownstone, as you can see here, and so many of them were built. So many of them survived. So many of them were out of brownstone that people just started calling row houses brownstones. And you often see that when people talk about brownstone New York, brownstone Brooklyn. Brownstone became a kind of nickname for any kind of row house, whether it's built out of brownstone or not. So going from the Federal to the Greek Revival to the Gothic Revival and now to the Italianate, one thing that happens is that they just get much more ornate. Brownstone, as I mentioned in the first part of our lecture, was plentiful. There were quarries in Connecticut, central part of Connecticut especially, and in New Jersey. So it was relatively cheap, and it's soft, so you could carve a lot of detail into it pretty easily. And it coincided with a period of immigration where there's a lot of skilled stonecutters coming over from Europe, Italy especially. So there was a endless supply of cheap labor to do all this stone carving. And the row houses start to get taller because the floor to ceiling heights start to get taller. And they often have an extra story. So instead of being 2 or 3 stories, they're now 4 and 5 stories. You can see here that they weren't always brownstone. A lot of times they were made out of brick. This particular example is brick, but then with brownstone around the windows and doors. And here you can see that the brownstone was applied to the facade, even the ones that have full brownstone facades. It's usually just the front facade, and the rest of the building behind it is brick. Occasionally you see Italianate row houses that were actually built with the real stuff, with marble, but that was much more expensive, so it's unusual. These 2 examples are in Brooklyn and are pretty intact, although they have a lot of detail missing. You can see the one on the right is missing the pediment above the door. And both of their cornices have had a lot of work done on them over the years, but very unusual to see marble facades. So this was such a popular mode of building that it just kind of caught on to the extent that by the end of the 19th century, into the 20th century, people thought that this type of housing was obsolete and outmoded and woefully out of date. And by this time, in the early 20th century, what people wanted to live in were not row houses, but apartment buildings. So big apartment buildings were really catching on and becoming fashionable. And these seemed antiquated. And Edith Wharton, in her novel, The Age of Innocence, which came out in 1920, mentions this. One of the characters mentions that Brownstone had coated New York like a cold chocolate sauce. So people started thinking of these endless rows of brownstones as being monotonous and just like a relic from a bygone era. Of course, now they are some of the most expensive buildings in the city, and you should be so lucky as to own your own brownstone. So they went out of fashion, and boy, did they come back into fashion. So let's look at some of the precedents for the detail in Italianate row housing. One of the motifs that you see a lot, which is really common, is the acanthus leaf. Here you can see a Greek column capital on the right, which also has the egg and dart motif there, which I showed you from the Gothic revival. But the lower part there, you see the leaves are carved. It's based on an acanthus leaf. You can see on the left. And here's a typical Italianate facade. So you can see it's a garden level, but then 4 stories above the garden level, a flat roof. The cornice gets really, really elaborate and detailed and projects cantilevers off the wall much more. The windows, like I showed you in the A.T. Stewart and Company store, are now fully framed on all 4 sides. There are these half-round hoods over the windows and doors. And as I mentioned, these are tall compared to the row housing that came before it. And because they got so tall, that means the stoops had to get wider and longer, not wider, but longer. And so the stoops become much more elaborate. You see really elaborate railings. And then you often see these brackets or consoles on either side of the door, and that's where you see the acanthus leaf detail carved into it. And then a really elaborate hood over the doorway. Here you can see on either side the acanthus leaf detail. That's all carved into the brownstone by hand. Here's another version of it. So why did things get more elaborate? That's a question. So if, there's always money in the city, and why was it that in the 1820s somebody would choose to build a pretty restrained federal style house, and then why by the 1840s and 50s and 60s would people choose to build this way? Well, it became more socially acceptable to show your money, to show your wealth to your neighbors than it had been in the 1820s, 1830s. That's one reason. And there was just a lot of money at this point. New York was getting wealthier and wealthier. or at least rather the people who had money were getting more and more of it. The divide between wealthy and poor was getting wider and wider. And so the wealthy part of the city was truly wealthy by the 1850s and 60s, and they had money. This was, the beginning of the Gilded Age, where there was like a lot of conspicuous consumption, and people were just showing off their wealth. That's basically what it was. Plus, as I mentioned, there was more and more immigrants coming over, and more people who were able to do this kind of work for cheap. So you want to carve a acanthus leaf into the doorway of my house and you're not going to charge me that much? Great, bring it on. So all of these things kind of came together to create this kind of architecture. Cheap labor, cheap materials, and lots of money. Okay, that's the end of lecture 9, part 2. And then the next thing you need to do, part 3, is the video, the virtual walking tour of Brooklyn Heights. So you can find that on YouTube and also on Dropbox. Okay, see you later.